Everything usually starts with something small, something you'd hardly think twice about. For me, it began with a pair of ripped jeans. I was folding laundry in the living room while Rachel lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. These jeans weren't mine, and they certainly weren't hers. They were too large to belong to her and too snug to fit me. A faint, unfamiliar cologne clung to the fabric. A sharp, woodsy scent, the kind that screamed expensive. "Whose jeans are these?" I asked, holding them up. Rachel barely glanced away from her phone. "Probably your brother's. Didn't he stay over last week?" she replied, her tone disinterested. The explanation didn't sit right with me. Sure, my brother had crashed on our couch one night after his car broke down. But these weren't his. He was at least 3 sizes bigger. Still, I let it go. I didn't want to overthink it or cause a fight over something that might have an innocent explanation. But the way she dismissed the question so effortlessly left a knot in my stomach. Over the next few days, that unease grew. Something was off, and it wasn't just her being distant. It was more than that. Rachel, the woman who used to kiss me goodbye with a smile every morning, had started rushing out the door as if she couldn't wait to be anywhere but here. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around carelessly, now never left her hand. She even brought it with her into the shower. Every time I tried to suggest plans, a dinner date, a weekend getaway, even just watching a movie at home, she'd shut me down with a laundry list of excuses. One evening, as I cleared the dinner table, her phone buzzed with a call. She didn't pick up immediately, just glanced at the screen before getting up and saying, "I'll be back in a sec." Her voice was clipped, her movements quick and deliberate. She stepped onto the patio to take the call, and curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the blinds. She was pacing, one hand running nervously through her hair while the other clutched the phone. And then I saw it, the smile. But it wasn't the kind she used to give me, warm and genuine. This was different. Hesitant, excited, almost giddy. It wasn't a smile meant for me. That night I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I tried to bridge the growing gap between us. Casually, I suggested we take a weekend trip to the lake cabin we used to adore. Her response hit me like a slap. "I'm too busy. Besides, it wouldn't be fun right now." Not fun. The cabin was our place, filled with memories of laughter and late-night talks. Her words didn't just sting, they cut deep. Later that day, while Rachel was in the shower, her laptop pinged with a notification. I hesitated, knowing it wasn't my place, but something, a blend of dread and suspicion, compelled me to check. It was an email thread with someone I didn't recognize. Neville Aldridge. The most recent message was short, just one line. "Tomorrow, same time, same place." Ice ran through my veins. When Rachel came out of the shower, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, her laptop in my hands. Without saying a word, I handed it to her. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her eyes barely flickered, but the slight hesitation was enough to confirm my fears. "Neville? Oh, he's just a guy from work. We've been collaborating on a big project," she replied, her tone sharp, defensive. "Why are you even asking?" I didn't respond. She grabbed the laptop from me with a huff, muttering under her breath as she left the room. But it wasn't her words that got to me. It was her voice, the way it trembled, the crack in her cool, dismissive tone. There was something there, bubbling just beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it erupted. The following day, I couldn't shake the email from my mind. "Tomorrow, same time, same place." Those words looped in my head like a warning siren. My instincts told me this wasn't about work. Neville wasn't just some colleague. I decided to stay home that day, feigning illness. Rachel didn't even bat an eye. She barely acknowledged me as she rushed out the door, phone already glued to her hand. That alone was unusual. She used to fuss over me, insisting on soup or medicine at the slightest sign of a sniffle. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I went into detective mode. I hated myself for it. Snooping through her things felt like crossing a line. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just paranoia anymore. I started with her laptop. Locked. Of course, It was locked that I muttered a quiet curse under my breath and moved to her dresser. Rachel was always meticulous, so I didn't expect to find anything out of place. But hidden beneath a perfectly folded stack of sweaters was a receipt. My heart sank as I read it. It was from a boutique hotel downtown, room 425. One night, dated 2 days ago. My hands trembled as I stared at the slip of paper. 2 days ago. That night, she told me she was working late on a client presentation. She even came home with a folder full of mock-ups to sell the story. The anger and disgust that surged through me were almost too much to handle. There was no mistaking it now. Rachel was lying to me. And this wasn't about something small like her phone or working late. This was bigger. I slipped the receipt into my pocket, grabbed my jacket, and left. If there was even a slim chance this was all some kind of misunderstanding, I needed to find out the truth for myself. The hotel lobby smelled of fresh flowers and lemon-scented polish. I felt completely out of place, standing there in my jeans and hoodie while polished professionals in tailored suits buzzed around me. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright, practiced smile, looked up as I approached. "How can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but detached. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out the receipt and placed it on the counter. "I'm here about this, room 425, 2 nights ago. I think there might have been a mistake." Her smile faltered slightly. "Let me check our system. One moment, please." She began typing, her manicured nails clicking softly against the keyboard. When her expression tensed, I knew she'd found something. "Yes, we had a guest in room 425 that evening. Is there an issue?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you tell me if the room was booked under Rachel?" I stopped myself, realizing how desperate I sounded. Her professionalism didn't waver. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't share that information without the guest's permission." My heart sank. Of course, she wouldn't tell me, but I wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. I decided to try a different approach. "Actually," I said, forcing a casual chuckle, "I left my phone charger in that room. Could I swing by and grab it?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncertain, but after a moment, she nodded. "I'll send someone up with you." The bellhop escorted me to room 425, opening the door and stepping back to let me enter. The room was pristine. Beige walls, crisp white linens, and a faint lavender scent lingering in the air. At first glance, it seemed perfectly unremarkable. But then I noticed something on the nightstand. A bracelet. My stomach dropped. It was Rachel's. A silver charm bracelet I'd given her for our anniversary. "Is that yours?" the bellhop asked, his voice curious. "Yes," I lied, snatching it up quickly before he could question me further. "Thanks. I've got what I need." I left the hotel in a daze, clutching the bracelet tightly in my pocket. That evening, when Rachel walked through the door, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. The bracelet lay in the center of the counter, gleaming under the harsh overhead light. She froze the moment she saw it, her expression neutral at first. But then her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak but thought better of it. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers clutched her purse a little too tightly. "Room 425. The boutique hotel downtown," I replied, my voice low but firm. "Care to explain?" Her eyes flicked to the bracelet, then back to me. For a moment I thought she might confess, but instead, she scoffed, her tone sharp and biting. "I can't believe you went through my things. That's such an invasion of privacy, Jameson. You've completely crossed the line." I blinked, caught off guard by her audacity. "I crossed the line?" I repeated, disbelief lacing my words. "Rachel, I found your bracelet in a hotel room. A room you never told me about." She shook her head, her expression hardening as she let out a scoff. "You're being ridiculous. It was a work thing, a brainstorming session. I must have left it there by accident." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that even startled me. A brainstorming session? At a boutique hotel. Her silence said everything her words wouldn't. Her silence was louder than any confession, and for the first time I saw her clearly. Someone who thought they could manipulate their way out of anything. Rachel's refusal to speak turned the air between us into a minefield. Every glance at her filled me with a fury I could barely contain. But despite my anger, I needed her to admit it, to stop treating me like a fool. A brainstorming session at a hotel, I said again, my voice low and steady, every word dripping with disbelief. Do you really think I'm that naive? She crossed her arms defensively, glaring at me like I was the one in the wrong. It's not what you think, Jameson, she snapped. My team had to work on an important pitch. The office was too noisy, so we booked a quiet space. End of story. End of story? I stepped closer, holding up the bracelet. Its silver charms caught the light as I waved it between us. You forgot this there? Just like you forgot to tell me anything about this little work session? And let me guess. Neville was part of your team too. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes narrowed, brimming with defiance. Yes, Neville was there. He's part of the team, and if you're so insecure that you can't handle me working with other men, then maybe that's your problem, not mine. Her words struck like a slap. The sheer audacity of her response made my blood boil. This isn't about insecurity, Rachel. It's about trust. Something you clearly don't care about anymore. Why didn't you tell me about the hotel? Why all the secrecy? She threw her hands up in exasperation, her voice rising. Because I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want to come home and deal with your passive-aggressive attitude about how I'm always working. I shook my head, incredulous. You're unbelievable. You really think I'm the bad guy here? I've done nothing but support you. I've given you space, been patient, and this is how you repay me. Her lips curled into a bitter smirk. Oh, please, Jameson, spare me the martyr act. You're not exactly perfect yourself. Something inside me snapped. Who is Neville to you, Rachel? And don't give me some rehearsed bull. I stopped myself, clenching my fists to keep control. Answer me. Who is he? For a split second, I thought she might break. Her gaze softened. Her lips parted like she was about to come clean. But just as quickly, her walls went back up. He's my coworker, she said flatly. That's it. I stared at her, searching her face for any glimmer of honesty, but all I saw was defiance. That night, Rachel claimed she had a headache and went to bed early. I stayed up, pacing the living room, my thoughts running in circles. Her story didn't just feel off. It was a tangled mess of lies. She wasn't just withholding the truth. She was doubling down, refusing to give me even a scrap of clarity. By midnight, I'd made up my mind. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd uncover it myself. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. I cloned her phone. It was easier than I expected. A quick download of an app, syncing it to her backup, and suddenly, I had access to everything. Texts, emails, even her location history. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages. A small part of me still hoping I wouldn't find anything incriminating. But then I saw it. A thread of texts between Rachel and Neville. Neville. I can't stop thinking about last night. You looked incredible. Rachel, you're sweet. Let's not text here. I'll see you Thursday. Thursday. Today was Thursday. I called into work, telling my boss I needed the day off. He barely asked for a reason. I had vacation days to burn. Rachel left the house a little after 8 a.m., her usual calm demeanor in place as she casually said she was heading to the office. But I knew better. Using the location tracker, I watched her drive across town. Not to her office, but to a cozy little coffee shop near the boutique hotel. My chest tightened as I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and followed her. Every mile felt like a lifetime, my heart pounding harder with each turn. When I arrived, I parked a few spaces away and watched as Rachel stepped out of her car. She was dressed to impress. Heels, a sleek black dress, and her hair styled to perfection. She wasn't heading to a work meeting. That much was clear. A few minutes later, a man pulled up in another car. He was tall, dark-haired, and exuded a kind of self-assured arrogance that made my fists itch. He greeted Rachel with a kiss on the cheek, the kind of casual intimacy that sent a fire roaring through my veins. They walked into the coffee shop together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I stayed in my car, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. Confronting them right there wasn't the plan, at least not yet. I waited, boiling with anger, as they emerged about 20 minutes later and drove off together, right back to the boutique hotel. I waited in my car until they checked in before storming into the lobby. The receptionist recognized me instantly, her polite mask slipping into wary caution. "Back again?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Yeah," I replied coldly. "Room 425. This time, I'm not asking." Before she could protest, I was already striding toward the elevator, my hands trembling as I jabbed the button for the 4th floor. My thoughts raced as I ascended, each one more enraged than the last. What would I find? What would I say? How far would this go? When the elevator dinged and the doors slid open, I stepped out, fueled by pure fury. The hallway felt endless as I approached room 425, my footsteps echoing with purpose. I pounded on the door, hard enough to make the frame shake. "Rachel, open the door," I barked. There was a moment of silence, followed by hurried whispers from inside. Then the door creaked open just enough for Rachel to peek out. Her face drained of color the moment she saw me. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, trying to wedge herself in the gap to block my view. "Move," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. She hesitated, her body tense, but before she could muster a response, a voice from inside the room called out. "Who is it, babe? Babe." The word ignited something primal in me. My fists clenched, and it took everything I had not to kick the door down right then and there. Rachel's eyes widened in panic, and she pressed against the door as if her weight alone could keep me out. But it was too late. "Babe," I snarled, shoving the door open with more force than I realized I had. Rachel stumbled back as I stepped inside, my pulse roaring in my ears. The room was exactly what I feared, dim lighting, the bed unmade, and the air heavy with the mingled sense of aftershave and perfume. Neville stood by the window, frozen mid-step. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway, revealing a chest that screamed overconfidence. He was younger than I'd imagined, and the cocky smirk plastered on his face disappeared the second he saw me. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking as his bravado faltered. I ignored him completely, my eyes locked on Rachel. She wasn't scared. No, she was furious. The kind of fury that only comes when someone gets caught red-handed. Her arms crossed over her chest like she was shielding herself, but her glare was defiant, daring me to say something. "What are you doing here, Jameson?" she snapped, her tone laced with venom, as if I were the one out of line. "I should be asking you that." I shot back, my voice cold as ice. "What's the excuse this time, Rachel? Another brainstorming session? A team-building exercise?" Neville stepped forward, his hands raised in a weak attempt to de-escalate. "Look, man, I don't know what you think is going on here, but—" "Shut your mouth," I snarled, cutting him off before he could finish. My tone was sharp, almost feral, and I didn't care. "I'm not here to talk to you. I'm here to deal with her." Neville froze, his mouth snapping shut as his shoulders tensed. At least he had the sense to stay quiet now. Rachel let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes as if I was inconveniencing her. "You're being dramatic, Jameson," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't what it looks like," Rachel said, her voice tight. I laughed, but it was bitter, hollow, almost painful. The sound bounced off the cheap wallpaper, making everything feel even more unreal. "Oh, really?" I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and shacking up with this idiot." "Don't call him that," she snapped, stepping forward with a defiant air. Her defense of him hit me like a punch to the gut. "So now you're protecting him?" I asked, my voice cracking in spite of myself. "Do you even hear what you're saying, Rachel?" Neville tried to step in, his tone defensive. "Look, we didn't plan for you to find out like this. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, glaring at him. "Let me guess. You're her work friend. The one she's been sneaking off to meet during all those late nights? Or maybe you're the one who invited her to the hotel last week. The one where I found this. I held up the bracelet, the final piece of the puzzle. Rachel's face twisted between anger and embarrassment. You went through my things? She spat, her outrage almost comical in its absurdity. Are you serious right now? I shot back, feeling a new wave of rage rise within me. You're cheating on me, and I'm the bad guy because I looked through your stuff? Neville opened his mouth to say something, probably condescending, but I shot him a look that shut him up in an instant. Rachel, however, seemed determined to dig her heels in further. I'm not cheating, she spat, her voice thick with venom. It's not like that. I love you, Jameson, but... She hesitated, and then the words came out cold and final. It's just a distraction from our life together. All my female colleagues have lovers, so this is simply my way to fit in. The room fell into a heavy silence. I stared at her, expecting her to laugh it off, to tell me this was all some sick joke. But she didn't. She stood there, arms crossed, chin raised, almost proud of her twisted justification. A distraction? I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. You've completely lost your mind, haven't you? Rachel scoffed, her eyes flashing with irritation. Oh, grow up, Jameson. Relationships evolve. You don't own me, and you don't get to dictate how I live my life. Neville, sensing the growing tension, tried again. Maybe you two should take a minute to cool off. Shut up, I barked, spinning on him. My fists clenched at my sides, and for a brief, dangerous moment, I considered swinging. But I stopped myself. I wasn't going to give him or her the satisfaction. Instead, I turned back to Rachel, my chest heaving with anger. You're right. I don't own you, but I'm not going to stand here and be disrespected either. You've made your choices. Now it's time for me to make mine. Her eyes flickered for just a moment. Panic, fear, maybe even guilt, but it was gone before I could register it. What are you saying? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I'm saying this is over, I said, my voice cold and final. Pack your things. When I get home tonight, I don't want to see you there. Her jaw dropped, but she quickly masked it, her expression hardening into something almost unrecognizable. You're seriously going to throw everything away over this? I laughed again, the sound hollow and empty. You threw it away, Rachel. Not me. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her and Neville standing there in stunned silence. The door slammed behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway like the final nail in a coffin. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my mind racing 100 miles a minute. Her words kept replaying in my head, a distraction from our life together. All my female colleagues have lovers, so this is simply my way to fit in. The sheer absurdity of it made my blood boil. Fit in? Like having an affair was the office equivalent of wearing the right shoes or gossiping at the water cooler. She had taken everything sacred about our relationship and reduced it to some twisted game of keeping up appearances. As I pulled into the driveway, I stayed in the car, staring at the house we'd built together. Every corner of it was soaked in memories. Painting the walls together, debating over furniture choices, and late nights on the couch watching awful movies. It had once been our home, a symbol of what we'd shared. Now it felt like a hollow shell, filled with lies I'd been too blind to see. When I finally stepped inside, the silence was stifling, almost oppressive. Her presence lingered everywhere, a cruel reminder of what I thought we had. Her jacket was casually draped over a dining chair, her shoes neatly by the door, and a coffee mug she'd used that morning still sat on the counter. Every detail mocked me, whispering of a life I thought was real but wasn't. I didn't wait for her to come home. Couldn't. The anger and betrayal boiling inside me left no room for patience. I grabbed boxes and started packing her things, not bothering to be neat or careful. Clothes, shoes, books. Anything that belonged to her went in without hesitation. As I worked, I uncovered fragments of a life she'd been hiding from me. A receipt for a spa day on a date she claimed she was at an out-of-town conference. A second phone charger that didn't fit any of our devices. A bottle of perfume I'd never smelled on her. Not once. It was everywhere. Evidence of her betrayal scattered like breadcrumbs, each one leading me to a truth I hadn't wanted to face. By the time she walked through the door, it was nearly midnight. I was sitting in the living room, the boxes stacked neatly by the door. She stepped inside, her face pale but her expression cold and composed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "So, you actually did it," she said, her voice flat. "You didn't leave me much of a choice?" I replied, forcing my tone to stay calm despite the storm raging inside me. She glanced at the boxes and then back at me. "You're overreacting. That did it." The dam I'd been holding back all day finally broke. "Overreacting," I shouted, standing up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. "You lied to me. You cheated on me. You've been sneaking around for who knows how long. And I'm the one being dramatic." She flinched but recovered fast, crossing her arms in that same infuriatingly defensive stance. "I already told you, it wasn't like that. It's not cheating if it doesn't mean anything." "Not cheating," I repeated, laughing bitterly. The sound was empty, a hollow echo of what I felt inside. "So what does cheating look like to you, Rachel? Because from where I'm standing, sneaking off to hotels with another man and lying about it seems pretty damn close." Her face twisted in frustration, her voice rising. "You're so black and white about everything. Relationships are complicated, Jameson. People change. Needs change. But I still love you. That hasn't changed." "Love," I snapped, pointing at the boxes stacked near the door. "This is how you show love. By treating me like a fool? By trampling on everything we built together." For a moment she hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the floor, but only briefly. Then, as if on cue, she deflected, her go-to move. "Well, maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed a distraction." It hit me like a slap. The room seemed to spin for a moment, and the white-hot anger I'd been clinging to shifted into something colder, deeper. Disgust. "Wow," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. "That's what you think of me? After everything I've done for you? After all the times I stood by you, supported you?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, her face a mask of indifference, though her eyes betrayed something more. Guilt? Regret? I couldn't tell, and I no longer cared. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, stepping closer, my tone firm and final. "You're going to take those boxes and leave. Tonight. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Her chin lifted defiantly, her eyes narrowing. "And what if I don't?" she challenged. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "Then I'll have the locks changed tomorrow, and I'll pack the rest of your stuff myself. Go ahead, try me." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. It took her about an hour to gather the last of her belongings and call an Uber. She didn't say goodbye when she left. She didn't even look back. When the door finally shut behind her, the silence in the house was deafening. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the empty spaces where her things had been just hours ago. The anger that had fueled me was gone, leaving behind nothing but a hollow ache. I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt broken. The next morning, the house felt alien. It wasn't just the physical emptiness, although her absence was glaring, with the bare spaces where her jacket, shoes, and mug should have been. It was the silence. For years, this place had been filled with her voice, her laughter, her presence. Now it was just me, and in the stillness, the weight of everything that had happened came crashing down. I thought the hardest part would be watching her leave, but I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how much of my life had revolved around her. Every decision, every plan, every piece of my identity was tied to being her husband. Without her, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I threw myself into distractions, anything to keep my mind occupied. I cleaned, reorganized the kitchen, and even scrubbed the grout in the bathroom tiles. But no matter how much I worked with my hands, My mind kept replaying her words like a cruel mantra. All my female colleagues have lovers, so this is simply my way to fit in. Who says something like that? How could she rationalize such betrayal so easily? I couldn't reconcile the woman I'd loved with the person who'd stood in that hotel room, justifying her affair like it was some casual networking strategy. Or worse, maybe this was who she'd been all along, and I'd been too blinded by love to see it. That thought hurt most of all. Around noon, my phone buzzed. For a brief second, my heart leapt. Part of me, stupid, desperate, thought it might be Rachel calling to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to say something that might undo the damage. But it wasn't her. The name on the screen was Kane, my brother. "Hey man," he said when I answered. His tone was light, oblivious to the storm I was in. "How's it going?" It was a loaded question, and I didn't have the energy to dress it up. "Not great," I admitted. "Rachel's gone." There was a long pause. "Gone?" he finally said, his voice laced with disbelief. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean she packed her things and left," I said, the words heavy and raw. "We're done." I don't even know what to say. "Are you okay?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'll get there." I didn't tell him everything. Not about Neville. Not about the hotel. Not about her outrageous excuse. It was all still too raw, too humiliating. Saying it out loud would make it too real, and I wasn't ready for that. "You want me to come over?" Kane offered, his voice soft with concern. "No," I replied quickly. The last thing I needed was company. "I just need some time to process." "All right," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But seriously, if you need anything, call me. Okay?" I thanked him and hung up, but the conversation left me feeling even more adrift. Saying it aloud, even in vague terms, made everything feel sharper, more real. And I wasn't ready for that reality. By evening, the anger began creeping back in. It wasn't the white-hot fury I'd felt in the hotel room. It was colder, sharper, more calculated. I wasn't just angry at Rachel. I was furious with myself. How had I let things get to this point? How had I missed the signs, the lies, the little breadcrumbs that had led me here? Worse, how had I allowed her to manipulate and gaslight me into thinking I was the problem? I grabbed my laptop and opened a blank document. I didn't know what I was going to write, but I needed to put it somewhere, to process it, to make sense of everything that had unraveled. Writing had always been my way of making sense of the chaos in my mind, and tonight, I needed clarity more than ever. I opened a blank document and started typing. Every lie Rachel had told. Every red flag I'd ignored. Every time she'd made me feel like I was the problem. As the words spilled out, I began to see it all with brutal clarity. How toxic she had been. How her actions had chipped away at me piece by piece. But what struck me the hardest wasn't the lies or even the betrayal. It was the sheer lack of respect she'd shown me. For our marriage. For us. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a new text. It was from Rachel. "Rachel, I'm sorry about how things ended. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. Sorry? That was all she had to say? After everything she'd done? My hands itched to respond, to unleash everything I was feeling. But I didn't. She didn't deserve a reply. The next few days blurred together. A roller coaster of anger, sadness, and introspection. Friends began reaching out, and I quickly realized Rachel had wasted no time spinning her own version of events. She was painting me as the overbearing husband who couldn't handle her independence. It was infuriating. I wanted to shout the truth from the rooftops, to tell everyone about the lies, the cheating, the humiliation. But I held back. Let her tell her story, I thought. The truth would come out eventually. By the end of the week, the fog of sadness had started to lift, replaced by a sharp clarity. Rachel hadn't just broken my heart. She'd burned the very foundation of our marriage to the ground and walked away without an ounce of remorse. The worst part? She probably thought she'd gotten away with it. Her weak apology still sat unanswered on my phone, taunting me. "I never wanted to hurt you." What a joke. If she hadn't wanted to hurt me, she wouldn't have cheated. She wouldn't have lied. And she certainly wouldn't have justified it by calling me boring and claiming it was her way of fitting in. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of what happened. If Rachel thought she could trample all over me and then stroll into a happy ending with Neville, she was sorely mistaken. The first step was gathering everything, every piece of evidence I had. The emails, the texts, the hotel receipts, even the backup of her phone. I meticulously organized it all into a folder on my laptop, cleverly titled Tax Records 2024. Next, I contacted a lawyer. Carol came highly recommended. A sharp, no-nonsense attorney who didn't waste time with pleasantries. When I laid everything out for her, she didn't mince words. She cheated, gaslight you, and now she's trying to make you look like the bad guy, Carol said bluntly, adjusting her glasses as she flipped through the evidence I'd sent her. It's disgusting, but it also gives us leverage. Leverage? I asked, leaning forward. Divorce isn't just about who's right and who's wrong, Jameson. It's about optics. And right now, you have a rock-solid case to walk away from this with more than just your dignity intact. She outlined the plan. File first, control the narrative, and prevent Rachel from twisting the legal system the way she twisted me. It made sense. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was regaining some control. But there was another part of me that wasn't content to let things slide. Rachel had humiliated me in ways I couldn't put into words. While I wasn't interested in petty revenge, I wanted the truth to come out. People deserved to know who she really was. I started small. Her social media accounts were still public, so I scrolled through them, searching for anything that might tell the real story. Most of her posts were harmless. Photos from work events, dinners with friends, the occasional motivational quote about living your best life. But then I found it. Picture from 2 weeks ago. Rachel, sitting across from Neville at an elegant restaurant, her smile glowing in the soft candlelight. The caption read, "Grateful for the people who make life special." My stomach turned. There it was, in plain sight. She'd flaunted it right under my nose that I felt a volatile mix of anger and vindication as I stared at the photo. Rachel had posted this while I was at home, cooking dinner and waiting for her to return from work. She hadn't just lied. She'd flaunted her betrayal, confident I'd never notice. I took a screenshot and sent it to Carol. "This won't win us the case," Carol said when we met the next day. "But it paints a picture. Combined with the receipts and texts, it's hard to deny what was going on." She was right. The photo wasn't just evidence, it was a slap in the face. Proof that Rachel had paraded her affair, certain I'd never put the pieces together. It was time to take control of the story. Rachel had already started poisoning the well, spreading rumors to mutual friends that I was some overbearing husband who couldn't handle her success. I wasn't about to let her smear my name unchallenged. One by one, I reached out to the people who mattered, friends, family, even a few of her colleagues I still got along with. I kept my message straightforward and calm, sticking to the facts. Rachel and I are separating. She had an affair, and I've decided it's time to move on. I'm not interested in bad-mouthing her, but I wanted you to hear it directly from me. The responses varied. Many were shocked and offered kind words or advice. Others were quieter, conflicted in their loyalty to her. And then there were the ones who weren't surprised at all. "You know, Rachel's been off for a while," one of her old college friends admitted over the phone. I didn't want to say anything, but I had a feeling something was going on. That validation was bittersweet. It confirmed what I already knew but didn't make the betrayal sting any less. The final piece of my plan fell into place when I reached out to Neville, not directly, but through his wife. Yes, Neville was married. Her name was Claire, and she was everything Rachel wasn't. Kind, genuine, and completely blindsided by the truth. "I'm so sorry to bring this to you," I said when we spoke, my voice heavy with guilt. "But I thought you deserved to know." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Thank you for telling me. I had no idea." I hung up feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Claire didn't deserve any of this, just like I hadn't. But at least now, she could make her own choices with the truth in hand. That night, Rachel called me. For the first time since she'd left, she sounded shaken. "Jameson, what did you do?" she demanded, her voice high-pitched and frantic. I don't know what you're talking about, I replied calmly, leaning back in my chair. Neville's wife just called him, she snapped. She knows everything. And now Neville's furious with me. Sounds like a personal problem, I said, my tone icy. Do you have any idea what you've done? She hissed. Yeah, I replied, a small smile creeping onto my face. I told the truth. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. And it felt damn good. Rachel's frantic call was just the beginning. By the next morning, the ripple effects of the truth had spread farther than I'd anticipated. Claire hadn't just confronted Neville. She'd gone nuclear. Neville, the suave and self-assured man Rachel had risked everything for, was unraveling. His perfect image, both professionally and personally, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Word traveled fast in their professional circles. Gossip spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before Rachel felt the fallout. She called me again later that day, her tone softer, less angry and more desperate. Jameson, I need to talk to you, she said. Can we meet? I hesitated. The thought of seeing Rachel again made my stomach twist, but a part of me was curious. What could she possibly have to say now? Fine, I said, keeping my tone as detached as possible. I'll meet you at the diner on Main. 30 minutes. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee cup cradled in her hands. She looked different. The confidence she usually wore like a shield was gone, leaving her looking almost vulnerable. Thanks for coming, she said softly as I slid into the seat across from her. What do you want, Rachel? I asked bluntly, not bothering with pleasantries. She flinched, but it took her only a moment to compose herself. I know you're angry. Angry doesn't even begin to cover it. I cut in, my voice steady but cold. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. Okay, I deserve that. I know I screwed up, all right? But this? She gestured vaguely, probably referencing the fallout with Neville and Claire. It's gotten out of hand. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my seat. Out of hand? You mean people finding out what you did? That's not out of hand, Rachel. That's accountability. She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. Jameson, you don't understand. Neville's furious. His wife is leaving him, and now he's blaming me for everything. He's saying I led him on, that it's all my fault. My job's at risk. Do you have any idea what that means for me? I stared at her, disbelief etched on my face. Are you seriously sitting here trying to make this about your problems? Rachel, you destroyed our marriage. You lied, cheated, and treated me like I was disposable. And now you're upset because your affair isn't working out the way you wanted. Her face crumpled for a moment, the mask slipping just long enough to reveal something close to regret. But she quickly recovered, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You don't get it. My career is everything to me. If I lose that, you'll still have exactly what you've earned. I cut in sharply, my voice like ice. Which is nothing. She stared at me, her lips trembling as if she wanted to argue. But no words came. For the first time, Rachel looked like she didn't know what to say. The conversation shifted after that. She tried bargaining, asking if I'd call Claire to smooth things over. Why the hell would I do that? I asked, incredulous. Because this doesn't just affect me, she snapped, her desperation spilling out. It affects you too, Jameson. What happens if word gets out that you're dragging me through the mud? People will think you're bitter, spiteful. Stop, I said, holding up a hand. Just stop. I'm not playing your games anymore. Rachel, you don't get to manipulate me into cleaning up your mess. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. For the first time, she looked genuinely defeated. When I walked out of the diner, I felt lighter than I had in years. For too long, I'd let Rachel dictate the narrative in our relationship. But not anymore. Over the next week, the fallout from her actions continued to spread. Neville was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, likely because Claire had shared the evidence I'd given her. Rachel's professional reputation was unraveling, too. The rumors about her and Neville swirled, and it became obvious that her once bright career was fading fast. I wish I could say I felt guilty for how things played out, but I didn't. Rachel had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through emails, a new message appeared in my inbox. It was from Claire. Claire, thank you again for telling me the truth. It was hard to hear, but I needed to know. If there's anything I can do for you, let me know. I stared at her words for a long time, struck by the strength and grace she had shown in the face of betrayal. Claire had handled the truth with more dignity than Rachel ever had. My reply was simple. Thank you. I was just glad I was finally moving forward. The strangest part of everything that had happened wasn't the anger or the fallout. It was the clarity. For the first time in years, I saw Rachel for who she truly was. Someone who valued herself above all else. And as painful as that realization was, I couldn't deny the gratitude that came with it, because now I could start building a life without her. The silence in the house wasn't suffocating anymore. Felt peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't living with that constant undercurrent of tension. The feeling that I had to tread carefully around someone who could lash out with frustration or deflection at the slightest provocation. Rachel hadn't contacted me since our meeting at the diner. That felt like a small but meaningful victory. Maybe she'd finally realized there was no talking or manipulating her way out of this. Even so, her shadow lingered. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old papers in the office, I stumbled upon a journal I hadn't seen in years. It was one of those things I'd started with good intentions but had abandoned halfway through. Flipping through its pages, I found entries from the early years of my marriage with Rachel. Rachel surprised me today with lunch at work. I didn't even know she remembered my favorite sandwich. I don't know how I got so lucky. We spent the whole weekend at the cabin. Just the two of us. No phones, no distractions. I've never felt closer to her. Each entry was like a time capsule, written by someone who truly believed in the life they were describing. But reading them now, they felt foreign, like they were messages from a stranger. I closed the journal and set it aside. That life was gone. It was time to stop looking backward and focus on the future. The next morning, I took a step I hadn't considered in years. I signed up for a gym membership. It wasn't just about working out. It was about creating a routine, having somewhere to go, and something to focus on that wasn't my own thoughts. I wasn't the only one there rebuilding. I met people who were starting over after breakups, losses, or years of neglecting themselves. We didn't need to share the details of our stories. It was enough to know we were all working towards something better. Being surrounded by others who understood the challenge of starting again made it easier. A few days later, Carol called me. Her voice was warm, carrying a note of good news. Rachel has agreed to the divorce terms, she said. I blinked in surprise. No pushback? No demands? None, Carol replied. She knows she doesn't have much ground to stand on. And from what I've seen, I think she's more focused on managing the fallout at work. The sooner this is over, the better for her. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Thanks, Carol, for everything. It's my job, she said, but I could hear the smile in her voice. You've handled this with more dignity than most people would. Be proud of that. Her words brought a wave of relief. Rachel agreeing to the terms meant the finish line was finally in sight. No more waiting. No more uncertainty. Just a clean break. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, watching the sunset. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. Just sat still and enjoyed the quiet. For so long, I'd believed my happiness was tied to my marriage, to the life Rachel and I had built. But now I realized that life had been a fragile house of cards. When it collapsed, it left behind an opportunity to rebuild, and I wasn't going to waste it. A week later, the finalized divorce papers arrived. I signed them without hesitation. It didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. To celebrate the finalized divorce, I decided to take a trip to the lake cabin, alone. It felt strange at first, being there without Rachel, but in the best possible way. The space felt like it was mine again, free from the weight of her judgments or detached indifference. I spent the weekend fishing, hiking, and sitting by the fire, letting the peace of the place seep into my bones. On the last night, as I sat on the deck watching the stars blink into view, Carol's words echoed in my mind. Be proud of how you handled this. And I was. No matter how hard Rachel had tried to tear me down, here I was, still standing. And for the first time in years I felt free. About a month after the divorce was finalized, life began to feel different. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when the weight of everything would hit me, but overall it was lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't scrambling to meet someone else's impossible expectations. Rachel had left a vacuum in my life, but I was slowly filling it with things that genuinely brought me joy. One of those things was reconnecting with old friends. During my marriage, I'd let a lot of relationships fade. Rachel hadn't been social, and she often dismissed my friends as unimportant or a waste of time. Without her voice constantly in my ear, I found myself reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. One evening, I met up with my childhood friend Owen at a local bar. He'd been one of the first to reach out after hearing about the divorce. When I told him the full story, his reaction was a mix of outrage and disbelief. Man, I always knew she was a little cold, he said, shaking his head. But this? She's on another level. Yeah, I agreed, taking a sip of my beer. It still feels surreal sometimes. Like, did that really happen? Owen leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. The important thing is you're out of it. He was right. Sitting there, laughing and reminiscing about old times, I realized how much I'd missed this real, genuine connections with people who actually cared about me. Work also became an unexpected refuge. For years, I'd let my career take a back seat to Rachel's ambitions. She'd always demanded so much of my attention and energy that I rarely had anything left to give to my own goals. But now, I was diving into my projects with a renewed sense of focus and purpose. My boss noticed the change, and within weeks, I was offered a promotion. It wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming control of my own life. Of course, Rachel hadn't completely vanished from my orbit. One evening, as I was scrolling through social media, her profile popped up in my suggested connections. Against my better judgment, I clicked. Her posts were different now. Gone were the polished, curated photos of her perfect life. Instead, there were vague, cryptic captions beneath generic pictures of sunsets and coffee cups. Starting over isn't easy, but it's necessary. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. I laughed out loud, surprising even myself. Rachel, the queen of control and composure, was trying to paint herself as the victim. It was almost impressive how she could turn her own destruction into a pity party. Shaking my head, I closed the app and put my phone down. Her life was no longer my concern. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, I felt more like myself again. I started revisiting hobbies I'd long abandoned, playing guitar, woodworking, even running. Slowly but surely, I was piecing myself back together. During one of my evening runs, I passed a woman walking her dog. She smiled warmly as I jogged by, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Hoped that I wasn't ready to dive into anything new, but that moment reminded me of something important. Life goes on. There were still good people out there, and Rachel's betrayal didn't have to define the rest of my story. The real turning point came during a weekend visit to my parents' house. After dinner, my mom, who had always been my biggest supporter, sat me down at the kitchen table. Her voice was soft but firm as she said, "I'm proud of you, Jameson. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've handled it with so much grace. Rachel didn't deserve you." Hearing those words felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. "She didn't," I replied, and for the first time, I truly believed it. By the time I drove home that night, I realized something profound. Rachel had taken so much from me. My trust, my confidence, my peace of mind. But she hadn't taken everything. I still had myself, my values, my strength, and with those I could rebuild. The chapter with Rachel was officially closed. It was time to write the next one. As the months passed, my life settled into something I hadn't expected. Calm. The chaos Rachel had brought into my world was gone, replaced by a steady rhythm that felt refreshing and new. I was rediscovering who I was, piece by piece, one small step at a time. But sometimes, life throws surprises at you when you least expect them. It happened one Saturday afternoon. I just finished grocery shopping and was heading to my car when I heard someone call my name. Jameson. I turned, startled, to see Claire, Neville's now ex-wife, standing a few feet away. She looked different, lighter somehow. Her short blonde hair caught the sunlight, and she was smiling in a way that was both warm and hesitant. "Claire," I said, genuinely surprised. "Hi." For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of unspoken history hanging between us. "It's been a while," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk to me." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, honestly curious. She shrugged, her smile faltering slightly. "I don't know. I mean, given how everything went down, I thought maybe you'd just want to leave it all in the past." "I do," I admitted, pausing for a beat. "But you're not the past I want to leave behind." Her smile widened, and she let out a small laugh. "That's kind of you to say." We ended up talking right there in the parking lot, our groceries forgotten as the conversation stretched on longer than I expected. She told me about how she'd left Neville almost immediately after our phone call. Within weeks, she'd moved out and filed for divorce. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," she said, her expression distant for a moment, "but also the best. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost until I got away from him." I nodded, understanding her words more deeply than I could express. "It's funny how that works, isn't it? You don't see it when you're in it." "Exactly," she said, her smile returning. For the first time, I noticed how easy it was to talk to her. There was no pretense, no tension, just two people who had survived something messy and come out stronger on the other side. As we were about to part ways, Claire hesitated. "Jameson," she began, her tone careful. "I don't know if this is too forward, but would you want to grab coffee sometime? I mean, no pressure, just as friends." For a moment I froze. The idea of starting anything, even something as simple as a friendship, felt foreign after everything I'd been through. As I looked at Claire, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I'd like that." She grinned, and we exchanged numbers before going our separate ways. That evening, I caught myself thinking about Claire more than I expected. It wasn't romantic, not yet anyway. But there was something about her that felt right. She understood what I'd been through in a way few others could, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't alone. When we met for coffee the following week, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything: our lives before the chaos, our hopes for the future, and even the small, mundane things that seemed insignificant but somehow mattered. Claire told me about her new job at a nonprofit she loved. "It's not glamorous," she said with a laugh, "but it's fulfilling. I finally feel like I'm doing something that matters." I shared how I'd been focusing on work, rediscovering hobbies, and rebuilding my life. "It's not easy," I admitted, "but every day, it gets a little better." By the time the coffee date ended, I realized something. I hadn't thought about Rachel once. That night, as I sat on my porch and looked up at the stars, a profound truth settled over me. For so long, I'd believed Rachel's betrayal had broken me. But now I saw it differently. Her actions hadn't destroyed me, they'd set me free. Meeting Claire felt like the start of a new chapter. Not because I needed someone to fix me, but because I finally felt whole enough to open myself up to connection again. The past was where it belonged, behind me, and for the first time I felt excited about what lay ahead. Claire and I continued to meet. Coffee turned into walks in the park, and when schedules allowed, the occasional dinner. It wasn't rushed or complicated. It was easy, natural. For the first time in years, I felt like I could just be myself, no fear of judgment or pretense. This wasn't about filling the void Rachel had left. It was about moving forward on my own terms. One evening, as we walked along the lake near the cabin, Claire turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about them?" The question caught me off guard. Them? I asked. She smiled faintly, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. Rachel, Neville, everything that happened. Do they ever cross your mind? I stopped walking, staring out at the water as moonlight rippled across its surface. Did they cross my mind? Sure. But not in the way they used to. Not really, I said honestly. Not in a way that matters. For a while, I let what they did consume me. My thoughts, my energy, my emotions. But now, they feel small, like a bad chapter in a book I've already finished. Claire nodded, her gaze turning distant. I feel the same way. Neville was such a big part of my life for so long. But now he just feels like a lesson. A reminder of what I don't want, and what I deserve instead. What do you deserve? I asked, genuinely curious. She looked at me, her eyes warm and unwavering. Honesty, respect. Someone who sees me as an equal, not a convenience. I smiled. You do deserve that. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with understanding. Then she broke the quiet. And what about you? What do you deserve, Jameson? The question made me pause. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. For so long, my focus had been on surviving the storm. I hadn't stopped to consider what I wanted on the other side. I guess I deserve the same, I said after a moment. Honesty, respect, a partnership built on something real. Claire smiled softly. Then I hope you find it. The months that followed were quietly beautiful. Claire and I didn't rush into anything. We were both cautious, still healing in our own ways. But the more time we spent together, the clearer it became that this wasn't just friendship. There was something deeper growing between us. Something we weren't quite ready to name but couldn't ignore. One night, as we sat by the fire at the cabin, Claire turned to me, her expression serious. Do you ever regret it? Regret what? I asked. Walking away. From Rachel. From that life. I didn't even have to think about it. No. Never. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Good. Because I don't regret walking away from Neville either. Not for a second. For the first time, I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. The future wasn't certain, but for the first time in years I wasn't afraid of it. Rachel's betrayal had taught me the value of boundaries, of knowing my worth, and of refusing to settle for less than I deserved. And Claire had reminded me that even after the worst storms, it was possible to find something beautiful again. The past was over, and the best parts of my story were just beginning.